Okay, welcome back to another lecture video. This lecture video will cover Chapter 15. Now, Chapter 15 is one of my favorite chapters because in Chapter 15 we're going to talk about the autonomic nervous system, which is our involuntary nervous system. The autonomic nervous system controls all of the involuntary actions that our bodies do. Any involuntary muscle actions or glandular secretions are going to be regulated by the autonomic nervous system. So I think that the autonomic nervous system gets a lot of slack for being a very difficult concept. Now, that being said, I will tell you that the autonomic nervous system is not a difficult concept to learn. However, the autonomic nervous system has a lot of layers and it can get a little confusing relatively quickly. So I'm going to take some extra time at the beginning of this lecture video to discuss the difference between the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system, and then we'll start to break down the specifics of the autonomic nervous system. So first and foremost, we're going to compare our body's involuntary nervous system with our body's voluntary nervous system. The somatic nervous system is our body's voluntary nervous system, and this is the nervous system that controls our skeletal muscles. We're then going to discuss the difference between the two branches of the autonomic nervous system, which are the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And then we're going to discuss how those two nervous systems differ and what functions each of those nervous systems will offer to the body. And then we'll discuss one of the most important concepts in this chapter, which is the anatomy of both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. The anatomy refers to different types of neurons and different types of receptors that can be found on those neurons. So we'll take some time to break that down in great detail. We're going to go a little deeper into the autonomic nervous system and discuss the different types of neurotransmitters that can be found regulating both of our autonomic systems. We'll learn how the sympathetic nervous system controls our fight or flight response, and we'll learn how the parasympathetic nervous system is going to control our rest and digest response. And one of the reasons that it's important for us to understand the autonomic nervous system and how it works is because oftentimes drugs can be used to affect the autonomic nervous system in a particular way that give our body a physiological response. So there are some big concepts here in Chapter 15, so let's get right into this. The autonomic nervous system can be found within the motor division of the peripheral nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system can be described as our involuntary nervous system. We do not have voluntary control of the muscles and the glands that are supplied by the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system is our involuntary nervous system because we don't get to choose the impulses that are sent out by this nervous system. While the somatic nervous system refers to our skeletal muscles, which we discussed in Chapter 10. So I like to think of the autonomic nervous system as our automatic nervous system. So we've seen this picture before. This is just to remind you about the structure of the nervous system and the branches of the nervous system as a whole. So the somatic nervous system and the autonomic system are two major different systems. Now there are a lot of similarities between these two nervous systems, and at the same time there are a lot of differences between the autonomic and the somatic nervous systems. If you can think back to Chapter 10 when we discussed skeletal muscles, you'll remember that somatic motor neurons are innervating the skeletal muscle fibers that we find in our skeletal muscles. But that's not the whole story with the somatic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is also going to include sensory neurons that take information into the central nervous system. So our sensory neurons are going to take touch, pain, sight, hearing, and taste information all into the central nervous system. And the motor neurons that we have innervating our skeletal muscles are going to offer us voluntary control to respond to all of that sensory stimuli. Now the autonomic nervous system is a little different. The autonomic nervous system is also going to include sensory and motor neurons. However, the sensory neurons are going to carry information from our different visceral organs and blood vessels that can be found within our bodies. These sensory neurons will take information into the central nervous system, and then our central nervous system will send outputs out of motor neurons. However, instead of just a single motor neuron like we saw in our somatic nervous system, the autonomic nervous system will be composed of two motor neurons that are arranged in series, which means that one neuron is just coming after another. So the effectors of our somatic nervous system are our skeletal muscles, and skeletal muscles receive voluntary innervation. Now, at the same time, we also discussed that there's a single motor neuron that's going to reach all the way from the central nervous system to the effectors. One motor neuron is reaching that entire length all the way to our skeletal muscles. Now, as we also discussed in Chapter 10, acetylcholine is going to be the only neurotransmitter that we find in our somatic nervous system. The synapse between a somatic motor neuron and a muscle fiber is known as the neuromuscular junction. We know that the synapse between a somatic motor neuron and a muscle fiber is called the neuromuscular junction, and acetylcholine is going to be the neurotransmitter that is released at the neuromuscular junction. So in the somatic nervous system, acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter that causes muscle contraction. Now, since the autonomic nervous system is our automatic or our involuntary nervous system, we know that the effectors are going to be our cardiac muscle and our smooth muscle, as well as our glandular tissue. Now, cardiac muscle and smooth muscle are not voluntary muscles. We cannot forcibly contract those muscles, even if we wanted to. Those all receive involuntary innervation, and they do not have any conscious control. Now, the arrangement of our motor neurons in the autonomic nervous system is a little bit different. We have two motor neurons that can be found in series, which just means that one motor neuron is going to be found housed within the central nervous system and projecting its axon out into the peripheral nervous system, and then our second motor neuron will be synapsing with that first motor neuron somewhere in the peripheral nervous system, and then that second motor neuron will project its axon out to the effector. And that's what I mean when I say that we have two motor neurons in series. It means that one comes after another. Now, in the autonomic nervous system, we're actually going to have two major neurotransmitters that play a role. And this is a little counterintuitive when we compare the autonomic nervous system to the somatic nervous system. So acetylcholine was our excitatory neurotransmitter that can be found in the somatic nervous system. When acetylcholine is released, we get muscle contraction. That's an excitatory neurotransmitter. In the autonomic nervous system, we're also going to have acetylcholine, and we'll also have another neurotransmitter known as norepinephrine. But the role of acetylcholine in our autonomic nervous system is actually going to be reversed. This is going to be our inhibitory neurotransmitter that we find in the autonomic nervous system. Now, that doesn't mean that acetylcholine doesn't have any excitatory effects. We will see the action of acetylcholine as we go. But norepinephrine is going to be our major neurotransmitter that causes an increase in our body's overall activity. So this slide just states pretty much most of the stuff that we've said on the last slides. But in the somatic nervous system, we're going to find acetylcholine, and that's always going to excite our skeletal muscles. And in the autonomic nervous system, we're going to have both norepinephrine and acetylcholine. Now, we often look at acetylcholine as our inhibitory neurotransmitter, but that's not truly the case. Acetylcholine isn't the inhibitory neurotransmitter, it's simply the neurotransmitter of the parasympathetic nervous system. And the parasympathetic nervous system's role is to decrease our overall body activity. This is in contrast to the sympathetic nervous system, where we want to increase our body's activity. And this nervous system is going to be controlled by the neurotransmitter norepinephrine. So it's not so simple to say that norepinephrine is our excitatory neurotransmitter and acetylcholine is our inhibitory neurotransmitter. Acetylcholine is going to excite certain organs, and norepinephrine is going to excite other certain organs. It just depends on which organ is receiving innervation from the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous systems. So the sympathetic nervous system is our fight or flight division. This is going to pick up our body's activity, and certain organ activity is going to increase along with the sympathetic response. The parasympathetic nervous system is our rest and digest division of the autonomic nervous system, and the parasympathetic nervous system functions to decrease our overall body activity. However, certain organs are actually going to pick up their activity based on parasympathetic innervation. So what we'll see is norepinephrine and acetylcholine will both have excitatory effects within the autonomic nervous system, depending on the organ that's receiving that neurotransmitter and the receptors that that organ contains. So before we get into the differences of the effects of acetylcholine versus norepinephrine, we first need to understand the structure of our autonomic nervous system. So I'll just say once more that in our somatic nervous system, we have a single neuron that reaches all the way from the central nervous system all the way out to our skeletal muscle. That is known as a somatic motor neuron. But in the autonomic nervous system, we have these two neurons in series. One neuron is going to be found in the central nervous system extending all the way out to a second neuron that's found synapsing with the first neuron. And these two neurons meet in a structure known as autonomic ganglia. Remember, ganglia are collections of neuronal cell bodies found within the peripheral nervous system. So in every autonomic nerve, we're going to see both preganglionic neurons and postganglionic neurons. The preganglionic neurons will have their cell body found inside of the central nervous system. They'll be housed in the spinal cord. And then that neuron is going to project and synapse with other neuronal cell bodies that are housed within the autonomic ganglia. And those other neurons that have their cell body in the autonomic ganglia are referred to as postganglionic neurons. So these postganglionic neurons will synapse with the effectors. Now, what we know about neurons is that they send signals down their axon. So that signal is going to transfer from the preganglionic neuron to the postganglionic neuron and out to the effectors. Now, I realize that might be a little difficult to visualize, so I have this picture here. Now, on this slide, we can really see the difference between our autonomic nerves and our somatic nerves. So the somatic motor neurons are going to reach all the way from the central nervous system all the way out to their effector, which is skeletal muscles. And we also know that somatic motor neurons are going to release acetylcholine, and that's going to cause an excitatory action in our skeletal muscles. That causes our skeletal muscles to contract. So this is what we learned in Chapter 10. This is what we should be comfortable with by now. But all of this other stuff here on the left side is new information. So let's take some time to go over the structure of autonomic nerves. So this picture is demonstrating two autonomic motor neurons in series. We can see that one neuron is housed within the central nervous system, and that motor neuron is going to travel out the ventral root all the way out and synapse at the autonomic ganglion, which is where we find lots of cell bodies of postganglionic neurons. Then the postganglionic neuron is going to be found synapsing with our preganglionic neuron, and this neuron will travel the rest of the way out to the effectors. So you can see that the preganglionic neuron has its cell body in the central nervous system, and the postganglionic neuron is going to have its cell body in the autonomic ganglion. Now this top picture is showing us sympathetic preganglionic and postganglionic neurons, and down here we see our parasympathetic preganglionic and postganglionic neurons. By now we really haven't discussed the difference between sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons. But in comparison to the somatic nervous system, we can see that we'll have both acetylcholine being released at these synapses as well as norepinephrine. Now, while this picture might not seem like it has a lot of information on it, this will actually be one of the most helpful pictures in this presentation. I'm actually going to direct you all back to this picture in just a little bit, and we're going to go over some more details on this picture. But for now, I just want you to be able to see the difference between autonomic motor neurons and somatic motor neurons. And we'll get into all of the other differences a little bit later. So our sympathetic nervous system and our parasympathetic nervous system make up the autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system controls our fight or flight responses, and our parasympathetic nervous system controls our rest and digest responses. What this means is that when the sympathetic nervous system is active and sending out signals, this is going to increase our body's metabolism and awareness. We can also call the sympathetic nervous system the E system, because this is the system that's firing during times of emergency, exercise, excitement, and embarrassment. We call this the fight or flight division because during times when we need to fight off an intruder or run from an intruder, this is the nervous system that is carrying us. Now the parasympathetic nervous system is referred to as our rest and digest division. This nervous system controls all of our body's activities that pertain to resting and digesting. So we often will call this the D system, which stands for digestion, defecation, and diuresis, which is just a fancy word for urination. The action of the parasympathetic nervous system is going to cause our overall body's action to decrease. So we call this the rest and digest division because during times of resting and digesting, this is the nervous system that is controlling all of our involuntary visceral organs. Now, on top of our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems having two different functions, we'll also see anatomical differences in the structure of our autonomic nerves and our sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons. So there are three major differences between sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons that we want to be aware of. Sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves differ from where on the spinal cord they are originating from. They differ in the length of their preganglionic and postganglionic axons, and they also differ in the location of their ganglia, how close or far that ganglia can be found to the spinal cord or to the visceral organ that it's innervating. So the origin states where these different nerves are originating at from the spinal cord. All cell bodies of our sympathetic preganglionic neurons can be found originating from the thoracolumbar region of the spinal cord. This is found between the cervical region and the sacral region. So the thoracic and the lumbar regions is where we find our sympathetic preganglionic neurons projecting out from the spinal cord. This is going to be different than where we find our parasympathetic neurons originating from. The cell bodies of our parasympathetic preganglionic neurons can be found originating in the brain and in the sacral spinal cord. And we see that shown on this slide right here. On the left side of the page, we see the sympathetic nervous system and all of our sympathetic neurons. And on the right side of this page, we see the parasympathetic nervous system and all of our parasympathetic neurons. Now, all autonomic motor pathways are going to have a ganglia where our preganglionic neuron is synapsing with our postganglionic neuron. But in terms of the origins of each of these preganglionic nerves, we can find that they will be found in different places. So our sympathetic preganglionic neurons will be found originating from the thoracolumbar region of the spinal cord. You can see all of these preganglionic neurons branching out right here from T1 all the way down to our lumbar region. So this is the thoracolumbar region of our spinal cord. Now our parasympathetic neurons are going to originate from the brain and from the sacral spinal cord. So we see these preganglionic neurons branching out from down here and all the way up here. But there's no parasympathetic preganglionic neurons that are originating from the thoracolumbar region. So the origins of the preganglionic neurons of each of these nervous systems will differ. So that's our first major difference between our sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons. The next difference is going to be the fiber length. The fiber length refers to the length of the axons of each of these two different types of neurons. In the parasympathetic nervous system, the axons of our preganglionic neurons are going to be very, very long, while the axons of our postganglionic neurons are going to be very, very short. And in the sympathetic nervous system, this is going to be reversed. We're going to have very short axons found coming off of our preganglionic neurons in our sympathetic nervous system, and we're going to have very long axons that are branching out from the postganglionic neurons in our sympathetic nervous system. So we can see that difference displayed on this slide as well. In our sympathetic nervous system, the axons of our preganglionic neurons are going to be very, very short. You can see that these are branching out, and they're actually going to be synapsing in this structure known as the autonomic ganglia, which are found very close to the spinal cord. So these axons are very, very short. These are our preganglionic neurons, and the axons of our postganglionic neurons are going to be much longer. So these axons of our postganglionic neurons in the sympathetic nervous system are going to be stretching most of the length from the spinal cord to the visceral organ themselves. Now this is reversed in the parasympathetic nervous system. In the parasympathetic nervous system, our ganglia are found closer to the visceral organs themselves. So these preganglionic neurons are going to have much longer axons, and those will travel out to the ganglia. And then the axons of our postganglionic neurons are going to be a lot shorter. So we can really see this demonstrated right here. This preganglionic parasympathetic neuron is going to reach its axon out, and that's going to travel all the way up to the visceral organ, and there's going to be a very, very short axon that belongs to our postganglionic neuron. So on top of the neurons of these two different nervous systems originating in different places, their fiber lengths of their preganglionic and postganglionic neurons are also going to be quite different. Now there's one other major difference between our sympathetic and our parasympathetic nerves, and that is the ganglia location. In the sympathetic nervous system, our ganglia is found much closer to the spinal cord, and in the parasympathetic nervous system, our ganglia is found much further away from the spinal cord and much closer to the visceral organ itself. Now this difference can be logically deduced by the different fiber lengths that we see. If the axons of our sympathetic preganglionic neurons are shorter, that means that the ganglia has to be located closer to the spinal cord because those preganglionic axons will not reach as far. So if these preganglionic neurons are short, the ganglia must be closer in the sympathetic nervous system. Now in the parasympathetic nervous system, where our preganglionic axons are much longer, those ganglia can be located much further out, away from the spinal cord and closer to the visceral organ. So we see that shown on this slide as well. Our autonomic ganglia are going to be found right here, located much closer to the spinal cord. And our parasympathetic ganglia are found much further from the spinal cord and closer to the visceral organs themselves. So these are three major differences that we see in the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. Now I'm going to take you back to this slide for just a second, because this slide will actually show some of those differences. Now I'll just mention once more that this picture up here is representing a sympathetic nerve, while this picture down here is representing a parasympathetic nerve. So we'll see some of these differences in this picture as well. The first thing that I want to point out is that the autonomic ganglia is located much closer to the spinal cord over here in the sympathetic nervous system than over here in the parasympathetic nervous system. And if our ganglia is located closer to the spinal cord, that means our preganglionic neurons in the sympathetic nervous system are going to have much shorter axons, and these postganglionic neurons are going to have much longer axons. And this will be reversed in the parasympathetic nervous system. The axons of our preganglionic neurons in the parasympathetic nervous system are going to be much longer, and the axons of our postganglionic neurons are going to be much shorter in the parasympathetic nervous system. So this is one of the reasons that I like this slide so much and encourage you all to use this slide to study, because from this slide we can infer a lot of information about sympathetic nerves compared to parasympathetic nerves. So we know that the sympathetic nervous system is our fight or flight division of the autonomic nervous system, and we know that the parasympathetic division is our rest and digest division of our autonomic nervous system. Now, both of these actions oppose one another. The sympathetic nervous system functions to increase body activity, while the parasympathetic nervous system functions to decrease body activity. So the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems are constantly antagonizing each other and opposing each other in their effects. This concept is known as autonomic tone, when the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems are fighting over control of our bodies. And when one of these systems wins, that's going to increase or decrease our body's overall function. So the hypothalamus is the major part of our brain that's actually going to control autonomic tone. And this is going to turn one of our systems up while it turns the other system down. Now, most of our organs receive both sympathetic and parasympathetic innervation. Some organs will only receive one type of innervation, but most of our organs are actually going to receive innervation from both of these two nervous systems. And so that means that most organs are receiving both sympathetic and parasympathetic signals at the same time. And the hypothalamus is going to be the mediator between these two systems, and which system is going to gain overall control over that particular organ. So this bullet point further explains how this works. Now this is an important bullet, so I'm just going to go ahead and read this. Increasing or decreasing sympathetic or parasympathetic autonomic tone has opposite effects. So what this bullet point is stating is that when sympathetic innervation increases, that's going to overall increase our body's activity. And when parasympathetic innervation increases, that's going to overall decrease our body's activity. But there's a little bit more to this bullet than just stating that sympathetic innervation increases body activity and parasympathetic innervation decreases body activity. It's also very important for you to understand that when sympathetic innervation is decreased, that's going to overall cause a decrease in our body's activity. And when parasympathetic innervation is decreased, that's going to overall increase our body's activity as well. So by simply turning off parasympathetic innervation, that's going to actually increase our overall body's activity. And this is the concept of autonomic tone. Now, some of the responses that we see exhibited by the sympathetic nervous system are going to increase our body's physical activity and pick up our body's metabolic rate. So this is why we call the sympathetic nervous system the fight or flight division, because in times of increased physical activity or emotional stress, the sympathetic nervous system is going to be overpowering the parasympathetic nervous system and controlling our body's overall activity. Sympathetic responses are a result of the sympathetic nervous system winning in the battle over autonomic tone with the parasympathetic nervous system. So we'll see different sympathetic responses during times of excitement, embarrassment, or exercise. Now, I think a more accurate way for us to look at the sympathetic nervous system is the action of the sympathetic nervous system is going to favor bodily responses to help us in times of fight or flight. When we need to fight off an intruder or we need to run away from a dangerous situation, the sympathetic nervous system is going to help increase our body activity so that we can protect ourselves from any potential danger. And some of these sympathetic responses that we see in our bodies are listed on this slide. So increased heart rate and blood pressure is going to be one of the major sympathetic responses that we see exhibited by the sympathetic nervous system. Let's consider the human body at a time of exercise. When we go and exercise, our heart rate is going to pick up because it needs to deliver more oxygen to our body tissues. And when heart rate increases, so will blood pressure. If we're in a situation where we potentially need to fight for our lives or run from a potential predator, it's important that we increase our heart rate because the increased oxygen is going to be used to make more energy. We'll also see airways dilating as one of our sympathetic responses. We need to get more oxygen into the lungs, so that's why our airways will dilate. One of the other responses that we'll see is the blood vessels that supply our skeletal muscles are actually going to dilate as well. And this is going to bring more oxygen and nutrients to our skeletal muscles to power our skeletal muscles so we can use them to either fight that predator or run from that predator. And of course, if our bodies are in need of energy, we're going to start undergoing glycogenolysis, which is the conversion of glycogen into glucose so that we can break that glucose down and make more ATP. Now there's this other sympathetic response right here in the center, which is a little different than the rest of these. So blood vessels going to the GI tract are actually going to constrict as a sympathetic response. So this is a different action than what occurs with the blood vessels that are going to our skeletal muscles. These blood vessels are going to dilate, while these blood vessels going to the GI tract are going to constrict. The sympathetic nervous system is a very efficient nervous system. So what we're going to see is that blood vessels to the GI tract are going to constrict to allow less blood to go to our digestive organs. And the reason that this occurs is because in a time of fight or flight, the last thing we need to be doing is digesting lunch. We need all of our body's potential energy going to the organs that are going to help us defend ourselves. So this is a sympathetic response that's actually going to shunt blood away from the GI tract so that it can take blood that contains oxygen to areas of greater importance that's going to help us with our action of fighting or flighting. So these are just some of the sympathetic responses that our bodies exhibit. So our body's parasympathetic responses are going to be quite different from our body's sympathetic responses. All of our body's parasympathetic responses are going to favor the actions of resting and digesting. So I think that the most important out of all of these parasympathetic responses is a decrease in our heart rate. Heart rate is going to go down with parasympathetic tone. So our heart rate's going to decrease because we don't need additional oxygen going to our skeletal muscles. Our resting rate is going to be sufficient. And one of the activities that we see taking place when parasympathetic tone wins out is digestion. We're going to see more muscle action in the smooth muscle of our GI tract. We're going to see increased salivation and increased lacrimation. Lacrimation is just a fancy word for secreting tears. As we know, we have the smooth muscles of our GI tract increasing. We're also going to see increased activity in our urinary system, so an increase in urination and defecation are also going to take place with parasympathetic responses. And in contrast to what we saw with our sympathetic responses, we're going to have bronchoconstriction. So these muscles in our airway are going to constrict because not as much oxygen needs to make its way into the body. So I'll just say again that our sympathetic nervous system is our E system. It's going to be active in times of emergency. So in times of emergency and exercise, we need to have increased heart rate and increased breathing so that we can supply our skeletal muscles. But at the same time, we're going to decrease salivation and also decrease digestion. Because at times of exercise and emergency, we don't need to be focusing all of our body's energy on digesting food. We need to focus all of our energy on whatever stimulating activity is in front of us. Now, the parasympathetic nervous system is going to decrease heart rate and breathing, and this is going to take place, of course, after times of emergency or exercise. So it's very possible that you are so invigorated by Chapter 15 in the autonomic nervous system that your sympathetic nervous system is firing like crazy and you're very excited about this material. But I would place my money on the fact that most of your parasympathetic nervous systems are going off as you watch this lecture. Now, on top of decreasing heart and breathing rate, we'll actually see an increase in digestion and associated activities. So the parasympathetic is not truly decreasing all of our body's activity, it's just helping to decrease the activity that doesn't need to be wasting energy when we're trying to focus on digesting and refueling our body of the energy that we might have just lost. So another parasympathetic response that we will see is an increase in the blood flow to the muscles of our GI tract. We need more blood flow going to our muscles of digestion so that we can refuel our body's energy stores. Now, I've already really discussed the concept of dual innervation. This is just stating that most organs receive innervation from both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. And in the body as a whole, the sympathetic is going to excite our body's activity, and the parasympathetic nervous system is going to inhibit our body's activity. Now, just keep in mind that certain organs are actually activated by the activity of the parasympathetic nervous system, but those are primarily going to be our organs of digestion. Now, a little side note about dual innervation is that most of the time our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems are going to oppose each other, as I've been mentioning throughout this entire lecture video. But there are some situations in which these two nervous systems can work together to produce body activities that actually work in cooperation for each other. So one example of cooperative activity that we see between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems is in the sexual response in the male. The parasympathetic nervous system is going to cause a dilation of the blood vessels that can be found in the penis, which will ultimately lead to an erection. Now, what's also interesting that we can see is that if the sympathetic nervous system is also trying to take hold of this organ, that might prevent vasodilation from occurring. But if parasympathetic innervation wins out, this will cause a vasodilation of the blood vessels in the penis and lead to an erection. Now, while the parasympathetic nervous system controls the erection in males, the sympathetic nervous system is actually going to control ejaculation in males. So a little mnemonic that we can use to help us remember which bodily response is controlled by the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems is point and shoot. So that about says it all. So while most of the time the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system will oppose one another, they can have cooperative effects at times. So I want you to keep in mind something I mentioned on the last slide. At times of emotional stress, or perhaps if anxiety is present, that's going to actually stimulate the sympathetic nervous system. And if sympathetic tone is overpowering the parasympathetic tone, that's going to prevent the formation of an erection. So this is where we're going to see the action of our first drug that will act on the autonomic nervous system, and that drug is Viagra. The mechanism of action of Viagra is to increase the release of a molecule known as nitric oxide. Now, one thing that we know about nitric oxide is that parasympathetic nerves are going to release nitric oxide. We'll abbreviate this with NO. The physiological response of nitric oxide is to relax smooth muscles. And when we relax the smooth muscle in our blood vessels, which is known as vasodilation, that's going to cause increased blood flow to the genitalia, and that will eventually cause an erection. Now, if there's the presence of alcohol or drugs or some type of psychological problems, which can bring on the stress or anxiety that I mentioned on the last slide, our patient may have problems getting it up. So this is where Viagra comes in. Viagra is going to increase the release of nitric oxide, and this will in turn cause more vasodilation and more blood flow to the male genitalia. Now, initially, Viagra was a medication that was formulated to decrease blood pressure. And in the clinical trials, they had a bunch of men on Viagra, and the doctors were realizing that it really was not as effective as they intended. So when the doctors eventually told the patients that they were taking them off of Viagra, the patients were showing a lot of opposition. And so this is where we actually found out that Viagra is going to increase nitric oxide release. And then it started to be used for other purposes. So that's where we get this side effect. So sometimes we will get a side effect of decreased blood pressure. Now, I realize that this says increased blood pressure. This is a typo. This should say decreased systemic blood pressure. So I want you to be aware that a side effect of Viagra is actually decreased blood pressure because this releases nitric oxide. This is a vasodilator. So that looks a lot better. So I will post this new version of these slides under your module for Chapter 15. So the next major topic that we're going to cover in the autonomic nervous system are the two different types of neurons and the different receptors that we find on each of those neurons. This is where things often tend to get a little confusing, so I encourage you to take some extra time with this material if you need to. So there are two major types of neurons that can be found in the autonomic nervous system, and they are named based on the neurotransmitter that they are releasing. So we will find cholinergic neurons, and we'll find adrenergic neurons. Cholinergic neurons are going to release acetylcholine. And this is how cholinergic neurons get their name. Cholinergic for choline, for acetylcholine. So all cholinergic neurons are going to release acetylcholine as their neurotransmitter. And our second type of neuron are the adrenergic neurons. And these adrenergic neurons are going to release the neurotransmitter norepinephrine. Now, norepinephrine is very similar to another neurotransmitter known as epinephrine. And epinephrine can also be known as adrenaline. So that's where we get this name, adrenergic for adrenaline. So norepinephrine has a very similar effect to epinephrine when it is released. So we have these two major types of neurons. We have cholinergic neurons that release acetylcholine, and we have adrenergic neurons that release norepinephrine. Now, even more important than the two different types of neurons are the receptors that can be found receiving these neurotransmitters on the postsynaptic cell. So remember, neurons are going to release neurotransmitters from their axon terminals, which are going to be synapsing with other cells, such as neurons and potentially other effectors. And the only thing that allows the action of these neurotransmitters are the receptors that can be found in the postsynaptic membrane. So we have two different types of cholinergic receptors. These are two different receptors that are both going to receive acetylcholine as its main ligand. And we'll also find two different adrenergic receptors, and those are referred to as alpha and beta. Now we're going to go over each of these receptors and what they do, but I first want to further explain cholinergic neurons. So on top of understanding what cholinergic neurons do and what neurotransmitters they release, it's also very important that we understand where we can find cholinergic neurons in our autonomic nerves. So this slide will shed some insight on where we can find our cholinergic neurons. So all preganglionic neurons that can be found in the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system are going to be cholinergic. In short, every single preganglionic neuron that we have is going to be cholinergic, and it will release acetylcholine. So that's already half of all of the neurons that we find in the autonomic nervous system. But what we'll also see is that all parasympathetic postganglionic neurons are also all going to be cholinergic. So in fact, most of the neurons in our autonomic nervous system are cholinergic. So every single preganglionic neuron, both sympathetic and parasympathetic, are going to be cholinergic and release acetylcholine, and all of our parasympathetic postganglionic neurons are also going to be cholinergic and releasing acetylcholine. So every cholinergic neuron is releasing acetylcholine that will eventually interact with cholinergic receptors that can be found in the postsynaptic membrane of either our postganglionic neurons or our effectors. So remember, in order for any signal to be transmitted at all, we have to have cholinergic receptors to receive acetylcholine found in the postsynaptic membrane. So this is where we're going to get into our different types of cholinergic receptors. We have two different types of cholinergic receptors, nicotinic receptors and muscarinic receptors. Now these two receptors are going to differ in where they are located and what their action is on the cell that they are found on. So we'll see that all nicotinic receptors will be excitatory. Whenever a nicotinic receptor receives acetylcholine, that is going to excite the cell that contains the nicotinic receptors. So what this means is that when our nicotinic receptors are activated, this is going to cause a depolarization in our postsynaptic cell. So in fact, these nicotinic receptors are going to be found on our ligand-gated sodium channels that we learned in Chapter 10. These are the receptors that are found at the motor end plates of our skeletal muscles in our somatic nervous system. So nicotinic receptors will always be excitatory, and that's why we have these types of receptors found in the somatic nervous system. But we'll also find some of these nicotinic receptors in the autonomic nervous system as well, and they'll have exactly the same function as they did in the somatic nervous system, which is always to excite the postsynaptic cell. So in the autonomic nervous system, we'll find nicotinic receptors present in the cell membranes of all of our postganglionic neurons. So these nicotinic receptors will receive acetylcholine from our preganglionic neurons, which are all going to be cholinergic. Now second, we have the muscarinic receptors. Muscarinic receptors can actually have two actions. They can either be inhibitory or excitatory, depending on the organ that contains the muscarinic receptors. So these muscarinic receptors are going to be found in the cell membrane of all of our parasympathetic effectors. These receptors are receiving acetylcholine from postganglionic parasympathetic neurons. And remember, in the parasympathetic nervous system, we'll inhibit certain organs and excite other organs. So with parasympathetic innervation, we see that acetylcholine that's released is actually going to decrease cardiac muscle activity. The parasympathetic response on the heart is to decrease heart rate. While at the same time, acetylcholine is going to activate smooth muscle that can be found in the GI tract, which is another parasympathetic response that we see. So it just depends on which organ contains the muscarinic receptors and whether or not those muscarinic receptors are inhibitory or excitatory for each individual organ. Now I know that this slide tends to be a little confusing. We've got a lot of cholinergic neurons and cholinergic receptors, and then we have nicotinic and muscarinic receptors. We've got a lot of stuff going on here, it's safe to say. So I'm going to quickly explain adrenergic receptors, and then I'm going to consolidate all this information on the next slide. So first and foremost, we need to understand where we can find adrenergic neurons before we can understand where we're going to find our adrenergic receptors. So for our purposes in this class, all of our sympathetic postganglionic neurons are going to be adrenergic, which means that our adrenergic receptors are going to be found on our sympathetic effectors. Now remember, adrenergic neurons release norepinephrine. And instead of acetylcholine, our postganglionic sympathetic neurons are going to release norepinephrine, and that norepinephrine will diffuse across the synaptic cleft and interact with adrenergic receptors found in the postsynaptic membrane. So we have a few types of adrenergic receptors, and we can group them into two major categories. We have alpha receptors, and we have beta receptors. Now, all alpha and all beta receptors are not all the same. Alpha 1 receptors specifically will have an excitatory effect, and alpha 2 receptors will specifically have an inhibitory effect. Beta 1 receptors are going to have an excitatory effect, and beta 2 receptors are going to have an inhibitory effect. So I'd like you to feel comfortable with each of these types of receptors, but just keep in mind that if there's a 1, it's going to be excitatory. If there's a 2, it's going to be inhibitory. So that should really streamline your understanding of these adrenergic receptors. Essentially, if you see a 1, it's excitatory. If you see a 2, it's going to be inhibitory. Now, alpha and beta will become important when we start talking about different drugs, but for now, let's just focus on the adrenergic receptors as a whole. So much like our cholinergic muscarinic receptors, the response of the release of norepinephrine can either be excitatory or inhibitory based on the tissue and the receptors that we can find on that tissue. So if an organ contains beta-1 receptors, when norepinephrine is released, that's going to produce an excitatory effect. And if another organ contains alpha-2 receptors, when norepinephrine is released and activates these receptors, that's going to produce an inhibitory effect. So we know that these adrenergic neurons are releasing norepinephrine, and they can be found in the sympathetic nervous system as postganglionic neurons. These are going to be the neurons of our sympathetic nervous system. So what's very interesting about these adrenergic receptors is that certain organs can contain both alpha and beta receptors. We'll find beta-1 receptors found on the heart, and this is an excitatory receptor, so when norepinephrine acts on beta-1, that's going to increase heart rate. And we'll find beta-2 receptors found in the bronchioles. Beta-2 receptors are inhibitory, so this is going to dilate our airways. So again, I more so want you to focus on alpha-1 and beta-1 as being excitatory receptors, and alpha-2 and beta-2 as being inhibitory receptors. So that will bring us back to this picture, and I'm finally going to explain why I like this picture so very much. One of the things that we can see on this picture I already mentioned is that our sympathetic preganglionic neurons are short and our sympathetic postganglionic neurons are going to be long. This will also help us to induce that the autonomic ganglion is going to be located much closer to the spinal cord than it is in the parasympathetic nervous system. And our parasympathetic preganglionic neurons are going to be much longer, and our parasympathetic postganglionic neurons are going to be much shorter. And you can see the difference in the location of these ganglia. Now, if we look a little deeper into this picture, one of the other things that we can see are the neurotransmitters that are going to be released at each synapse. And this is going to help us to infer what types of neurons are going to be found where, and what types of receptors are going to be receiving those neurotransmitters. So one thing that we can see is that at the autonomic ganglion of our sympathetic nerves, we are releasing acetylcholine. That tells us that these sympathetic preganglionic neurons are cholinergic. These are releasing acetylcholine. So these neurons here are cholinergic. And at the same time, our parasympathetic preganglionic neurons are releasing acetylcholine as well. So this goes back to the statement that I made that all preganglionic neurons are going to be cholinergic because they release acetylcholine, and that is shown right here on this slide. We'll also see that our postganglionic parasympathetic neurons are going to release acetylcholine as well, so that makes these cholinergic neurons, and we'll see that our sympathetic postganglionic neurons are going to be the only ones that release norepinephrine. So these neurons are going to be our only adrenergic neurons that we see. So there's actually quite a bit more to this slide than I initially explained. Based on the neurotransmitters that are being released by each of these neurons, we can infer what types of neurons are releasing that neurotransmitter. Now that's actually not everything that we can see on this slide. There's one other thing that we can infer from this picture, and it is the different types of receptors that we can find receiving these neurotransmitters. So if these are cholinergic neurons, we have to have cholinergic receptors to receive that acetylcholine. It would make no sense that we'd have adrenergic receptors here because they wouldn't be able to respond to acetylcholine anyway. So these cholinergic receptors are going to be found in the cell membrane of all of our postganglionic sympathetic neurons and all of our parasympathetic postganglionic neurons as well. So cholinergic receptors are going to be found in the cell membrane of all of our sympathetic postganglionic neurons, our parasympathetic postganglionic neurons, and our parasympathetic effectors. All of these neurons and organs will have cholinergic receptors to receive that acetylcholine. Now remember, we have two different types of cholinergic receptors, nicotinic and muscarinic. Nicotinic are always going to be excitatory, so we'll always find nicotinic acetylcholine receptors found in the autonomic ganglion. These postganglionic neurons are going to have nicotinic receptors because they'll always be excited by this acetylcholine to send their signals out to the effectors. So because we have these two neurons in series, it's important that every time our preganglionic neuron sends a signal out, we are activating our postganglionic neuron as well. So that's why we will always see nicotinic receptors found in the cell membrane of our postganglionic neurons. Now our other type of cholinergic receptor were the muscarinic receptors, and we will find those receptors in the cell membrane of all of our parasympathetic effectors. This is the receptor that can have either an excitatory or an inhibitory effect based on the organ that we're looking at. And so because we're releasing acetylcholine from this cholinergic postganglionic neuron right here, these will have muscarinic receptors. So I'll just state once more that our muscarinic receptors will either excite or inhibit organs based on what their parasympathetic innervation is. Now the only place that we're going to find adrenergic receptors are places that we can receive norepinephrine. So those will only be on our sympathetic effectors. Adrenergic receptors, alpha and beta, will be found on our sympathetic effectors. So each effector is going to have both adrenergic receptors and also muscarinic receptors as well. And depending on the neurotransmitter that gets released, that's going to determine which receptor is activated and ultimately determine the action of that organ at that time. So hopefully by now you can see why I love this slide. This is a big slide. I want you to definitely feel comfortable with the information presented on this slide, as it sums up quite a bit of the information that we've discussed throughout this lecture video. Now just one other side note, the other place that we find nicotinic acetylcholine receptors are going to be in our skeletal muscles. Nicotinic receptors are always excitatory, so acetylcholine will always be released to excite our skeletal muscles. So that will take us into a little pharmacology and how certain drugs affect the autonomic nervous system. Now before we get into different drugs and how they work, it's important that we understand two words first. And those words are an agonist and an antagonist. Now these are not agonists and antagonists for muscle groups, these are different agonists and antagonists. An agonist is a substance that binds to a receptor and mimics the action of a neurotransmitter that is received by that receptor. So an agonist for the cholinergic receptors will mimic the action of acetylcholine being released at the synaptic cleft. And an antagonist does just the opposite. It's going to bind to a receptor, and that's going to prevent the binding of the neurotransmitter. So that will produce the opposite effect of the neurotransmitter binding. So certain agonists and antagonist drugs can be used to increase or decrease sympathetic or parasympathetic tone. So two examples of drugs that work on the parasympathetic nervous system are atropine and neostigmine. Atropine is an antagonist for muscarinic acetylcholine receptors. This means that atropine is going to bind muscarinic acetylcholine receptors, and it's going to produce the opposite effect as acetylcholine would have produced at that receptor. So let's remember where our muscarinic acetylcholine receptors are found. We can find our muscarinic acetylcholine receptors in the cell membrane of our parasympathetic effectors. When acetylcholine is released and interacting with muscarinic receptors, this is going to produce a parasympathetic response. So when we administer atropine, this is going to produce the opposite effect as acetylcholine would have had. And this is because this is an antagonist. So atropine really does have a sympathetic effect. We call it an anticholinergic. It's going to block acetylcholine from binding and prevent those parasympathetic effects from taking hold. So we'll often use atropine when we go to the hospital or when we go to the eye doctor. Atropine is going to dry up saliva. It's going to prevent salivation, which is a parasympathetic response. It will also be used to dilate pupils, which is going to be how the pupils are existing with sympathetic tone. Now, of course, every drug has side effects, so one of the side effects that we will have is increased heart rate, because this is also a sympathetic response. Our autonomic nervous system is not very specific. It doesn't have many good ways to localize its effects to certain organs, and that's why we often produce an overall increase in our body's activity with sympathetic innervation. So this is why we will have increased heart rate as a side effect to atropine, because overall, atropine is producing a sympathetic response in our bodies because it's an antagonist at muscarinic acetylcholine receptors. This is going to block acetylcholine from binding at our parasympathetic effectors and ultimately produce a sympathetic response. Neostigmine is our other drug that affects the parasympathetic nervous system. Neostigmine's mechanism of action is actually binding to and inhibiting acetylcholinesterase. So ultimately, this will prevent the breakdown of acetylcholine in the synaptic cleft. We call this drug an anticholinesterase. So let's think back to Chapter 10. Acetylcholinesterase's purpose is to break down acetylcholine in the synaptic cleft so that acetylcholine is not just hanging out in the synaptic cleft indefinitely. However, if we prevent the breakdown of acetylcholine, that's going to prolong acetylcholine's lifetime in the synaptic cleft. So one condition that we will often use neostigmine to treat is myasthenia gravis. This condition, myasthenia gravis, refers to a lack of acetylcholine receptors that can be found in our skeletal muscles. So this impairs the activity of our skeletal muscle, and it's very hard for patients to produce movements. And so if we can prolong the activity of acetylcholinesterase in the synaptic cleft, that's going to help improve skeletal muscle activity, because acetylcholine will have more time to interact with the few receptors that we have. So these are two examples of drugs that work on the parasympathetic nervous system. We also have a few drugs that will specifically work on the sympathetic nervous system. And first and foremost, we're going to cover nicotine. Nicotine stimulates nicotinic receptors, and this is where these receptors got their name from, is because nicotine activates these receptors. So if we're stimulating the sympathetic nicotinic receptors, that's going to increase blood pressure and heart rate because we're increasing our sympathetic tone when we administer nicotine. Another group of drugs that we see affecting the sympathetic nervous system are a class of drugs known as monoaminoxidase inhibitors. Monoaminoxidase is an enzyme that breaks down norepinephrine in the synaptic cleft. So monoaminoxidase inhibitors can often be used to treat depression. Oftentimes with depression, we have decreased activity of norepinephrine in the synaptic cleft. Perhaps norepinephrine is being removed too readily, or we don't have as much of a norepinephrine release. So by targeting the enzyme that breaks down norepinephrine, we can prolong the activity of norepinephrine inside the synaptic cleft. This drug has a very similar mechanism of action as neostigmine. Phenylephrine is our next drug that's going to affect the sympathetic nervous system. Phenylephrine's mechanism of action is that it's an alpha-1 agonist. Alpha-1 is an adrenergic receptor that's excitatory. So phenylephrine is going to stimulate alpha-1 receptors, which is going to stimulate the organ that has those receptors. So phenylephrine is actually going to mimic the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic response that phenylephrine gives us is that it's going to constrict blood vessels that can be found in the nasal mucosae. And if we're constricting these blood vessels, that's going to decrease mucus production and ultimately reduce mucus congestion. So I know that there's a lot of drugs and each of these have a different mechanism of action. But I want you to be focusing on whether or not these drugs are agonists or antagonists, or whether they are affecting some other player such as monoaminoxidase or acetylcholinesterase. Our last class of drugs are known as the beta blockers. And the one example of a beta blocker that I would put on your test if I ask you a question about this one will be propranolol. So beta blockers have a lot of efficacy in lowering blood pressure. And this is why they're often prescribed for hypertension, and hypertension just refers to high blood pressure. So what's interesting about our beta blockers is that they can either be selective or non-selective. A non-selective beta blocker will block both beta-1 and beta-2 adrenergic receptors, while a selective beta blocker is going to block just beta-1 receptors or just beta-2 receptors. So if we have beta-1 receptors found on the heart and we administer beta blockers to that beta-1 receptor, that's going to antagonize that beta-1 receptor. And beta-1 is an excitatory receptor, so if we antagonize the excitatory beta-1 receptor, that's going to produce an inhibitory effect. So that is why beta blockers will actually decrease heart rate and blood pressure. If we do use non-selective beta blockers, this can produce different side effects. But any question on your test involving beta blockers will specify which organs contain which receptors. So as long as you understand the concepts of agonists and antagonists and how they affect different receptors, you should be just fine to answer these questions on my test. Now the one thing that I want you to focus on this slide is that some organs only contain sympathetic innervation. There's no dual innervation to any of these organs. So just be aware that sweat glands will only contain sympathetic innervation. The erector pili muscle will only have sympathetic innervation, and the kidneys will only have sympathetic innervation. So with each of these three different structures, if we want to decrease their activity, we can't use parasympathetic innervation to decrease it. We would have to decrease it by decreasing sympathetic tone solely. Now I just want to take a quick second to mention that we also will have autonomic reflex arcs as well. We discussed reflex arcs in chapter 13, but the components of an autonomic reflex arc are the exact same as the somatic reflex arc. We'll have receptors, a sensory neuron, some type of integrating center, motor neurons, and some type of effector that's going to produce a response. So by now, I don't think I need to mention how vital the nervous system's action is for the rest of our bodies. The nervous system as a whole allows for communications of one part of our body with another. The nervous system is going to help us control our voluntary skeletal muscles so that we can move our bodies around freely, but at the same time, our nervous system is going to control all of our involuntary muscles that help keep us alive. So like all of the other 11 body systems, the nervous system is contributing to each other body system in some way. Now we'll finish up chapter 15 with one clinical condition, and that clinical condition is known as autonomic dysreflexia. Autonomic dysreflexia often occurs in individuals that have upper spinal cord injuries, and ultimately what results is an exaggerated sympathetic response. So if our sympathetic tone is exaggerated, we're going to see sympathetic responses as our symptoms. We'll often see hypertension as a symptom of autonomic dysreflexia, as well as sweating and an overfilling of the bladder. The bladder empties due to parasympathetic response. So if the sympathetic response is taking over the parasympathetic response, that's going to cause the bladder to overfill. So that will conclude our lecture video for chapter 15 and the autonomic nervous system. I will see you all in the next lecture video where we'll discuss general senses in chapter 16.